Hi, I'm Brad Kraft. I'm a bookseller here at University Bookstore, and I've been gone for a while. Now I'm back. Now, being gone, what that means is I haven't been able to tell anybody what to read, and that's been hard. Instead, I was at home watching a stupid amount of television. A lot of it was true crime, and I have a few complaints first. First, I don't like unresolved mysteries. I don't like not knowing. So if I'm going to devote hours of time to something, I kind of want the killer to be caught. I don't need any more indefinite conclusions and theories. I want to know. Second, I really like those drone shots, where they go drifting down a really long, lonesome country road, or they go drifting down a really long, empty beach, or they go drifting down a really long, empty suburban street. I like those shots, but enough already. 2, maybe 3, not all the time. Lastly, if you're going to tell a true crime story on television, if you can afford to do those really elaborate drone shots and little miniatures of cities and things, you can afford to buy decent hair. As somebody who remembers, mostly, the 70s and 80s, I can assure you that while our hairstyles were really quaint, there were a lot of mullets and feathering, none of us wore thick acrylic wigs cut with kindergarten safety scissors. Anyway, I'm glad to be back among books where I can read true crime the way it was meant to be. So I have a few recommendations. First, a couple of serial killer books. I know it's not to everyone's taste, but these are unique. First, The Babysitter by Liza Rodman and Jennifer Jordan. It's from Atria Books. Now, what if, in your somewhat cloudily remembered childhood, and a traumatic childhood at that, you suddenly, as an adult, learned that the person who was your babysitter was also a serial killer? That's this story. Now, the authors do a couple of things I don't especially approve of or particularly like, including reconstructing the thought processes of people long dead, but they're clearly based on interviews, and police interviews specifically, with the killer. And what this story does is it tells you the story of this particular serial killer, Tony, but it also tells you the story of the author's childhood, which was a mess. And the good part about it is, in fact, the best parts of the book are about her life and how, briefly, in 1969, it happened to coincide with this famous killer. It's an unlikely story. I've never read anything quite like it before. Her mother took care of motels, and whenever she wanted to go out, she was a bit of an alcoholic, she would put her children in the care of whatever adult happened to be by, including the local personality, shall we call him, who happened to be a handyman about the place, and who in fact was a serial killer. He never harmed her. He did take her to his secret garden, where he raised marijuana, among other things, and where he explained to her, people keep secrets. It's a fascinating story, and I've never encountered anything quite like it before. The next one is also a serial killer book, but again, it's unlike serial killer books I've ever read. It's called Last Call by Elon Green, and it is from Celadon Books. And this is the story of a serial killer in New York City and surrounding areas in the 80s and the early 90s, a period that was very difficult for some of us, including for the men described in this book. And yes, there is a serial killer, and yes, he is killing gay men. What makes this particularly interesting is the author has made a point of telling the stories of the victims, the men who were killed. Most of them were closeted white men of a certain age who frequented local piano bars. If you don't know what that is, congratulations, you're young. But what they were places where gentlemen of a certain persuasion could go and sing show tunes around a piano, usually with a host. And these were fellows who had to keep a great portion of their lives secret. That made them vulnerable. And in telling their stories, as well as the story of the man who killed them and the police who investigated, we learn something about a time that is both gratefully lost and people whose memory would otherwise be likewise lost. It's a strangely moving story. I really recommend it. Next, completely different, there's a historian named Russell Shorto. He wrote The Island at the Center of the World and a book about Amsterdam, the Dutch in New York. They're very, very entertaining and very smart popular history. But this book opens when he went home and was talking to family, all the older family that still survived, and they asked him why he hadn't told the story. What story is that? And why does he need to tell it? He's not someone who writes memoir or injects himself personally into the stories he tells, but it turns out there was a story, one that he sort of remembered, but that almost nobody really talked about. This book is called Small Time, a story of my family and the mob. And that's what it is. It turns out Grandpa was a bit of a personality. He had a talent for numbers and a habit of drinking too much. Have you noticed a theme? Anyway, he remembers meeting Grandpa on the street one day, who promptly took off a very expensive watch and put it on his tiny little boy's wrist. Pretty much their only encounter. There's a reason why people didn't talk to Grandpa. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, small Rust Belt city, very dear to where I grew up in my home. And Grandpa was the brains behind the local mob. They ran numbers, they did gambling, they did all sorts of things. And it turns out it's a better story than Shorto ever imagined. And he began investigating it, as he would as a historian, and he discovered, among other things, a murder. It's different in many ways from the first two books I mentioned. The murder is, in fact, appropriate enough, fairly small time. It's of another gangster. And was Grandpa responsible for that, as he was for so many things, good and bad? Fascinating story, and an unlikely setting for a mob story. Usually these involve major mafiosi and big cities like New York and Chicago. Here's the mob in a small town setting where it was very active, and again, in a time and place that is otherwise lost to history. Fascinating. Finally, a book by an author I love. Her very first book was called The Queen of Whale Cay. I still treasure it. It's an eccentric story about an eccentric woman who had a lot of money. Since then, she's written a number of things, including The Wicked Boy. Her name is Kate Summerscale. And let me find another. Oh, The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher. I believe it was made into a television film. Very good storyteller and very good stories. And her new one is called The Haunting of Alma Fielding, a true ghost story. Very different again from the others recommended. Alma Fielding is a lower middle class woman in London who suddenly starts manifesting jewelry out of the thin air. One day a turtle appears in her lap in a car as she drives. She's haunted by poltergeists smashing crockery around her house. How is all of this happening? Eventually, there's a fellow from the psychical research group who comes to investigate, and this becomes a story of their interaction, of a strange period before the Second World War, when suddenly poltergeists appeared all over the place. It's also a portrait of another lost time, that moment before war changed everything, and when anxieties were being expressed in some truly unusual ways. Now, before any of you who have my own prejudice, share my prejudice against supernatural stories, this story is not always what you think it's going to be. In fact, it's full of surprises and things I would never have anticipated, and I love a good grift. I also love any time the people involved in not so much criminal behavior as, well, eccentric behavior, aren't entirely aware, and if there's someone who tries to explain it, the explanation is dated about as well as the phenomenon described. And yet it's fascinating to find out about these people in this place. And I can't imagine anybody who could have done it better than Kate Summerscale. I recommend everything she's ever written. They're all delightful. Anyway, that's enough for now. Go read these books. Thanks.